Sanguine Blade, and Hurricane on Senna? What? Hello summoners and welcome to another ProGuides video. I'm Zyrene and today we're going to be talking about 15 of the most interesting builds on the world stage. Now that we're at the end of the season and the best of the best are duking it out, we get to see not just the mechanical skill at the highest level, but also their strategy. And while strategy usually applies to macro skill and team fighting strength, item builds are also a key factor when it comes to winning games. But before that, today's question of the day is, now that Worlds is underway and we've seen action from all of the teams, who is your favorite to win the whole thing? Personally, I'm rooting for Damwon. Their drafts are creative, their team play is clean, and individually all 5 players are able to beat or at least hold their own against pretty much all of their counterparts on other teams at Worlds. Be sure to let us know your answer in the comments below. And one last thing, be sure to visit us at ProGuides.com. We have the best rosters of coaches, top-tier live classes from instructors like Mike Young and Saskio, and courses covering a variety of roles and champions from your favorite pro players like Doublelift. I also highly recommend that you guys try out our VOD review feature. The way it works is you send in a replay file, and the coaches send you back a fully reviewed VOD. It's a super convenient option that saves you guys a ton of time, so go give it a try. Now, without further ado, let's get started. To start things off, we'll be looking at Volibear. Since his rework, he's been a solid flex pick between top and jungle, and while his jungle build remains largely the same, a lot of top laners are building to rush 40% CDR as quickly as possible. Usually this is done with Iceborne Gauntlet and Black Cleaver. When you consider Volibear's lane opponent at Worlds as being Camille or Renekton in the vast majority of his games, you can see why this build is so strong. The armor makes it so he takes very little damage, the CDR allows him to spam his W for huge damage and healing in extended trades, while the item passives both slow his opponent and give him movement speed, allowing him to chase them down. There are a couple of variations with the build, such as taking Trinity Force over Cleaver and Gauntlet, and building Death Stance and Spirit Visage after, but the idea is the same. Max out CDR to spam W for huge damage and healing, and then flex your build after to meet the game's needs, with options for being either more of a damage threat or more of a massive wall to engage for your team. One really good example of a flexible Volibear build was Rascals when Genji took down LGD. He started off with the Gauntlet Cleaver combo, making him able to easily fight 1v1, 2v2, and 5v5s against the AD heavy enemy team. With his team having plenty of damage elsewhere, he then used his last 3 item slots on Gargoyle Stoneplate, Randuin's Omen, and Locket of the Iron Solari, making him not only a nearly unkillable tank, but also allowing him to give a huge shield to his carries in fights. Speaking of flexible builds, Impact's Shen build caught the attention of many viewers. Solari in the top lane hasn't been uncommon at Worlds this year, but it's usually built later in the game, while Impact decided it was best to build it second in this game. He then followed it up with Knight's Vow, showing that he had full faith in his team to carry this game. To explain his build a bit, the enemy team also had a lot of front-loaded AoE damage, while his own team was relatively short-range, with every champion but Twitch being pretty much in the middle of the team fights. Since his squishy allies were inevitably going to be getting beat up in fights, Solari helped to mitigate a ton of incoming damage. With his team in a good spot to keep forcing fights, he further itemized to protect his carries, buying Knight's Vow to try and keep Twitch alive in the coming fights. This build is more than just a variant on the norm for Shen. He basically turned himself into a second support to match the flow of the game. Don't just try to copy this build every game, it's not a cookie cutter build. The next interesting build we've seen pertains to Tahm Kench. While we have seen him with Unsealed Spellbook and Guardian as per usual, Mickey X and Yuyanjia have each played him with Hail of Blades, which gives him a cheesy, surprisingly strong ability to fight, and even force all-ins. While Hail of Blades does make Tahm Kench very potent when he can get onto a target, one thing to note about this is that it was brought against Nautilus and Pantheon, meaning it's seen as an answer to melee supports with hard engage, since those champions generally either go into force fights or do nothing at all, without any real in-between. Against more versatile champions like Thresh and Lux, the standard Guardian or Unsealed Spellbook works better, or at least it's more consistent. Galio has been played and built in a variety of ways, from one-shotting AP Mage to AP Bruiser in the mid lane to full tank support down bottom. But one thing that's been relatively consistent is that most Galio players have always gone for Aftershock or Unsealed Spellbook. But one thing that's come into play in more recent times, and has now been popularized due to Worlds, is Galio mid lane with Predator. One problem Galio has is that he relies on an ally diving in, or the enemy team engaging to use his ultimate to effectively get into the midst of a fight. And when his ultimate isn't up, he really doesn't do much, since the enemy knows to just stay out of range of his dash. He can't even really use Aftershock against enemy teams that have the ability to kite, since he can't even reach his targets, much less CC them. Predator gives Galio a way to run down slippery enemies, and gives him a way to be useful in skirmishes and teamfights even when his ultimate isn't available. While it's not exactly a brand new strategy, seeing Pantheon played as a support is a nice reminder that not all champions played in the role are tanky CC bots or shielding Ardent Sensor builders. Pantheon brings point-and-click CC that lets him rival the other engaged support's ability to force all-ins, while also having insanely high burst damage, making him a potent support when paired with an aggressive lane bully of an ADC, especially one like Ashe. He's built purely to deal damage, so you bring Conqueror, and his first two items being Umbral Glaive and Black Cleaver. It's definitely a pick that wants to get a lead, snowball with it, and close the game out fast, since Pantheon's only speed setting is go in, kill enemies, maybe die. But he does that super well, so honestly the lack of flexibility is a bit forgivable in this case. And where someone like Pantheon needs to be ahead to be useful, Nidalee is a much more versatile pick. Sure, with a lead, you can snowball and be a hard carry, building AP items like Lichbane and even Rabadon's Deathcap, but her standard build usually involves Athene's Unholy Grail and Zhonya's Hourglass, giving her enough AP to do some damage, but giving her some safety and utility for consistency. In LGD's game against LGC in the play-ins, Peanut showed just how powerful such a flexible champion can be, since he knew his team had plenty of damage, and his job was to fill the slots by providing utility in any way that he could. After picking up the standard Athenes, he deviated from building into any type of AP item, instead building a Mikhail's Crucible, helping to prevent his team from being picked off by the enemy's catch. With Draven on the enemy team building 2 lifesteal items, he even picks up Morellonomicon to ensure his team has a way to apply grievous wounds on the high priority target, allowing the rest of his team to build more efficient items for themselves. Another really common trend for the top lane as a whole is seeing most champions, especially Ornn, build Locket of the Iron Solari as their 3rd or 4th item to add to their teamfight utility. Basically, Ornn provides a ton of crowd control and is a massive wall of tank stats with his ornaments, so building a 3rd tank item just for himself doesn't really do as much as the fat AoE shield he can grant allies by going Solari. But the item isn't limited just to Ornn. We've already talked about Shen and Volibear building it, but in TES's win over Dragon X, 369 built the item on Renekton, valuing the utility of the item over building into an item for split pushing. For the times when just building Locket top lane isn't enough, Nuguri showed us that he can just straight up play support from the top lane. With DWG locking in Pantheon support and having 2 marksmen, he didn't really need to be a threat. He just needed to enable his team to carry harder. And sure, he could have just picked a tank to engage fights, but with Sylas, Pantheon, and Ashe, his team honestly had enough engage. Instead, he opted to take the Lulu flex pick top lane, and built exactly how a support would, minus the Spell Thieves. While most Lulu solo laners start with Luden's Echo and pick up Rabadon somewhere in their build, Nuguri reached a full 6-item build with Boots, Athenes, and all 4 healing and shield power items. In case it wasn't clear yet, a lot of the interesting item builds we're seeing at this year's Worlds revolve around flexibility, and SOFM took this concept pretty far by building full tank on Lee Sin in Suning's game against G2. That's right, aside from his warrior jungle item, he didn't have a single offensive item. Instead, he opted for Knight's Vow, Spirit Visage, and Warmogs. If he did a normal bruiser build this game, he likely would have just been kited or blown up whenever he tried to go in. Flexing to this tanky utility build actually worked pretty well. He was able to go into fights to land his slow without getting killed, could shield out to his allies, and used his kick to peel. Sure, absolutely, he was missing some damage, but this was a pretty clever and, in my opinion, winning strategy. Yes, Suning lost this game, but it was due to Syndra and Ashe dying back to back without using their flashes, and no Lee Sin build could have changed that. Quite some time ago, and for the 30th time ever, a new Kaisa build surfaced that involved building an early serrated Dirk and making Essence Reaver your first item. Players put 2 and 2 together and realized that this strategy also works on both Lucian and Misfortune. Both of these champions are lane bullies, and the cheap but very effective power spike of serrated Dirk and BF Sword helps them push their early game strength ridiculously hard. especially in Misfortune's case, where a single Q can bring a squishy bot laner under half HP when it kills a minion first. While those two marksmen are taking an old build and making it their own, it seems like Senna has been constantly evolving with her unique builds, and at Worlds alone, we've already seen a few different variations. But there are 3 new builds that stand out above the rest. First, we have Zeitnot's variant, where he picked up Runaan's Hurricane as his 3rd item in Supermassive's game against ITZ. With the enemy composition being primarily melee champions that wanted to dive him, Hurricane allowed him to cleave them all down, applying Glacial Augment Slow to kite them as he did. Next up, we had Kramer's boot preference. While almost all Sennas go boots of swiftness, unless they have a defensive option, Kramer is the one ADC player that opts for Berserker's Greaves, sacrificing the kiting and chasing of Swifties for a higher damage output. And the last one we'll look at is Ghost's choice to go Sanguine Blade in DWG's game against PSG. While I can't really say whether or not this was a good choice, when you stop and think about it, if the enemy team has 1 tank and 4 ranged champions, Sanguine Blade's passive can kick in if you position well enough. It seems a little hard to pull off properly and is very situational at best, so maybe don't try this one at home. While it isn't exactly new, Unsealed Spellbook has recently grown very high in popularity, with most Zoes, Twisted Fates, and Gallios that aren't using Predator opting for this keystone. The only real condition for taking Unsealed Spellbook on a champion is that the champion doesn't really have a keystone that synergizes super well with what they do in the game. In these cases, these champions get a lot more out of having an extra summoner spell in a team fight, or when looking to set up a gank, than they do from getting damage or other stats from a different rune. And on a closely related note, while we're pretty used to seeing Unsealed Spellbook on certain mid laners and supports, Nuguri brought it out on Kennen in the top lane in Damwon's game against PSG. Just like the mages before, this allows him to swap to a more aggressive summoner for some kill pressure in lane, without having to give up the massive advantage that Teleport grants. While most players autopilot Kindred's build, picking up a Black Cleaver and Rapid Fire Cannon as their first 2 items after Warrior, in Dragon X's win over FlyQuest, Pyosik showed what it means to understand your target selection, and how to itemize accordingly. While Cleaver certainly would have helped kill Ornn a bit faster, Pyosik opted into buying Stormrazor and then an Infinity Edge, giving him huge burst damage for killing the other 4 squishy targets on FlyQuest's side. And for our last entry, most Akali players used to build Gunblade first, followed by Morellonomicon and Zhonya's Hourglass. But as TES's Knight showed us, the new build pros have switched over to is Liandry's Torment as the second completed item on Akali. The reasoning? Akali used to be a fairly bursty champion, so Morello and Electrocute worked well for killing squishy targets in seconds. But now, whether she's dueling bruisers, cutting down tanks, or assassinating ADCs, securing the kill takes some time in a somewhat extended fight, as you have to weave your Qs and passive autos in with your other abilities, instead of face rolling your keyboard. And in these extended fights, you just get a lot more out of Liandry's, making it the better option. And that is it for our 15 most interesting builds at Worlds. I hope you guys liked it, and if you think we missed anything, be sure to let us know. And don't forget to let us know which team you think is most likely to win it all in the comments below. I can't wait to see you guys back at the next video, but until then, good luck on the Rift, stay safe, wash those hands, and try not to cry over your pick'ems too much.